Hi, well, welcome back to James Talks Death. Today I'm going to be reacting to a video that I have been very excited to watch. I've done my best not to click on it at any point because I want to record my initial reaction. So it's called Let's Talk About Dying with Peter Saul. It is a TED Talk. I have no idea what to expect. Peter Saul is not a name that I'm familiar with at all. But yeah, I hope it's going to be as interesting and exciting to you as it is going to be to me. But let's get ahead with it. TED Talk is great for everything, as I'm sure everyone knows.
Look, I had second thoughts really about whether I could talk about this to such a vital and alive audience as you guys. But then I remembered the quote from Gloria Steinem, which goes, "The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off."
Thanks, I didn't want to be more excited, it's fine.
So with that in mind, I'm going to sort of do those things here and talk about dying in the 21st century. Now, the first thing that will piss you off undoubtedly is that all of us are in fact going to die in the 21st century. There will be no exceptions to that. There are apparently about 1 in 8 of you who think you're immortal on surveys, but unfortunately this isn't going to happen.
Is that true? 1 in 8 people think they're immortal? That can't be right. I suppose it depends to define immortal, isn't it? So whether or not you mean like spiritual, astral immortality, or you mean, well, I suppose that's the only thing really. How can you possibly think mortal otherwise when we're bodily mortal? Interesting.
While I give this talk in the next 10 minutes, 100 million of my cells will die. And over the course of today, 2,000 of my brain cells will die and never come back. So you could argue that the dying process starts pretty early in the piece. Anyway, the second thing I want to say about dying in the 21st century, apart from it's going to happen to everybody, is it's shaping up to be a bit of a train wreck for most of us, unless we do something to try and reclaim this process from the rather inexorable trajectory that it's currently on. So there you go, that's the truth. No doubt that will piss you off, and now let's see whether we can set you free. I don't promise anything. Now, as you heard in the intro, I work in intensive care. And I think I've kind of lived through the heyday of intensive care. This has been a ride, man. This has been fantastic. We have machines that go ping. There's many of them up there. And we have some wizard technology, which I think has worked really well. And over the course of the time I've worked in intensive care, the death rate for males in Australia has halved. And intensive care has had
I didn't think it was Australian.
Certainly a lot of the technologies that we use.
I'd assumed it would have been American, just given how the TED
So we have had tremendous success. And we kind of got caught up in our own success quite a bit, and we started using expressions like life-saving. I really apologize to everybody for doing that, because obviously we don't. What we do is prolong people's lives and delay death and redirect death, but we can't, strictly speaking, save lives on any sort of permanent basis. And what's really happened over the period of time that I've been working in intensive care is that the people whose lives we started saving back in the 70s, 80s and 90s are now coming to die in the 21st century of diseases that we no longer have the answers to in quite the way we did then. So what's happening now is there's been a big shift in the way that people die, and most of what they're dying of now isn't as amenable to what we can do as what it used to be like when I was doing this in the 80s.
He's referring to like cancer maybe and dementia for reasons of dying, or people dying of that age group that he's discussing. I'm not entirely sure, but it sounds like he's got a medical background, works in intensive care. Maybe that'll be the focus of the video. 80s and
90s. So we kind of got a bit caught up with this, and we haven't really squared with you guys about what's really happening now, and it's about time we did. I kind of woke up to this bit in the late 90s when I met this guy. And this guy is called Jim Smith. And he looked like this. I was called down to the ward to see him. His is the little hand. I was called down the ward to see him by a respiratory physician. He said, look, there's a guy down here, he's got pneumonia, and he looks like he needs intensive care. His daughter's here, and she wants everything possible to be done, which is a familiar phrase to us. So I go down to the ward and see Jim, and his skin is translucent like this. You can see his bones through the skin. He's very, very thin, and he is indeed very sick with pneumonia. And he's too sick to talk to me. So I talk to his daughter, Kathleen, and I say to her, did you and Jim ever talk about what you would want done if he ended up?
I know that she's going to say, no, we haven't. And this was, again, one of the reasons why I really wanted to create a channel discussing death, because of stuff like this. Is you get to a situation where suddenly you're faced with, have you discussed it with the person who's now facing the situation? And a lot of the time, if not all the time, we always say, no, we haven't, because why would we? You know, it's not common to do so in Western culture. But I really hope he goes into that a bit more.
Situation. And she looked at me and she said, no, of course not.
See?
I thought, okay, take this steady.
So they're annoyed that death is a thing.
And I got talking to her, and after a while she said to me, you know, we always thought there'd be time. Jim was 94.
There's plenty of time.
And I realized that something wasn't happening here. There wasn't this dialogue going on that I imagined was happening. So a group of us started doing survey work, and we looked at 4,500 nursing home residents in Newcastle, in the Newcastle area, and discovered that only 1 in 100 of them had a plan about what to do when their heart stopped beating.
I can't confirm whether or not, you know, through statistics, if that is similar in the UK, where I'm from, but only talk about Newcastle, I imagine it's in Newcastle, Australia, not Newcastle, as in upon Tyne in England. But I imagine it's very similar here. You say it's very similar cultures between here and Australia. Obviously, they're not the same, but they're very similar, especially when they approach dying. So I imagine it would be very similar with what we've got.
1 in 100. And only 1 in 500 of them had a plan about what to do if they became seriously ill. And I realized, of course, this dialogue is definitely not occurring in the public at large. And I work in acute care. This is John Hunter Hospital. And I thought, surely we do better than that. So a colleague of mine from nursing called Lisa Shaw and I went through hundreds and hundreds of sets of notes in the medical records department, looking at whether there was any sign at all that anybody had any conversation about what might happen to them if the treatment they were receiving was unsuccessful.
Given his narrative, he's probably going to say no.
And we didn't find a single record
Not
of any
one
reference about goals, treatments, or outcomes from...
A lot of the time it's because doctors think that it's... The medical field is, if someone dies, it's almost seen as a failure. You didn't heal them from the illness that they had or the disease that they had that they went into hospital with. And I personally think that's a wrong way of approaching it. It's the case where you do what you can, as the daughter asked, but apart from, you know, what we've got with modern medicine, with medication, dying is still going to occur. It's how can we see it as a failure if it's an inevitability? Which, again, I'm hoping he gets onto as well.
Any of the sets of notes initiated by a doctor or by a patient. So we started to realize that we had a problem. And the problem is more serious because of this. What we know is...
It was a big change, I believe, in the 20th century, where hospitals became more of a thing, that most people then went from dying at home to dying in a hospital. For people my age, it's almost impossible to think about not dying in a hospital, because why would you? You want to go into hospital to try and not die. That's the whole point, isn't it? And that's such a big change that's happened in Western culture, but also just culture in general with the advance of medicine. And that, with the decline of supernatural belief and religion that is occurring, again, not as much of a rate as I initially thought, but still occurring, it leaves people with not knowing how to die. When you haven't got the normal funeral rites that are in place, such as changes for being buried to cremation or something along those lines, you don't have a set way to deal with it. So you don't have a set tick box, almost exercise of going through the grief stages that has worked for people previously. And moving away from that, it obviously means that dealing with death is becoming increasingly something that's difficult, especially because people live longer. So it's even the case where you don't want to consider it because people will be living longer, and that's even more than a surprise. Whereas in the Middle Ages, up until very recent history, death was something that people dealt with every day. You couldn't go out after dark because a wolf might attack you, for example, or someone might try and kill you in a fight in a bar or something. So it is, again, it's a big change that's occurred. And again, this is just from what I've learned. There's a famous French philosopher who talks about this. I can't remember his name for the life of me at the moment, but I will be talking about him in a future date, and I will put his name in the description or a comment just to let you know who I'm talking about, because very famous in this field.
That obviously we are all going to die, but how we die is actually really important. Obviously not just to us, but also to how that features in the lives of all the people who live on afterwards. How we die lives on in the minds of everybody who survives us. And the stress created in families by dying is enormous. And in fact, you get 7 times as much stress by dying in intensive care as by dying just about anywhere else. So dying in intensive care is not your top option if you've got a choice.
Yeah, I imagine it's where most people do die, because if you're in intensive care, you're in desperate need of it, and therefore you are on that path. Not many of us would probably die outside of intensive care, maybe in like palliative care or things like that, or a very reduced number of us would be, I'll say reduced, it's probably increasing slightly, but die in our own homes out of choice, or even dying through companies such as Dignitas, such as with assisted dying. So yeah, this is very interesting.
And if that wasn't bad enough, of course, all of this is rapidly progressing towards the fact that many of you, in fact about 1 in 10 of you at this point, will die in intensive care. In the US, it's 1 in 5. In Miami, it's 3 out of 5 people die in intensive care. So this is the sort of momentum
be higher than
that we've got at the moment. The reason why this is all happening is due to this, and I do have to take you through what this is about. These are the 4 ways to go. So one of these will happen to all of us. The ones you may know most about are the ones that are becoming...
This is talked about a lot in Atul Gawade's Be Immortal book, and I very highly recommend that book. It was one of the reasons that got me interested in this particular subject. To be honest, I always had an interest in it, but it streamlined it to see that there is actually a way to study it and not just that everyone's constantly thinking about it all the time. So that I would definitely recommend, but it talks about these graphs, how before it would go up and down, up and down, up and down over a long period of time. So it was more like your life as a whole as opposed to how you die. And because of modern medicine, you will slowly decline and then suddenly just boom, you over time will just dramatically, and it's such a big change, and as we know, humans, change is difficult to deal with, that we struggle to deal with it. We struggle to accept that this big change is occurring as fast as it is.
Increasingly of historical interest. Sudden death. It's quite likely in an audience this size, this won't happen to anybody here. Sudden death has become very rare. The death of little Nell and Cordelia and all that sort of stuff just doesn't happen anymore. The dying process of those with terminal illness that we've just seen occurs to younger people. By the time you've reached 80, this is unlikely to happen to you. Only 1 in 10 people who are over 80 will die of cancer.
Well, I mean, because surely they would have died before they got to that age.
The big growth industry are these. What you die of is increasing organ failure with your respiratory, cardiac, renal, whatever organs packing up. Each of these would be an admission to an acute care hospital, at the end of which, or at some point during which, somebody says enough is enough and we stop. And this one's the biggest growth industry of all, and at least 6 out of 10 of the people in this room will die this form, which is the dwindling of capacity with increasing frailty, and frailties in...
A question that I think might be worth contemplation, and it's something that's came straight to me and maybe worth with yourselves, is if you had to pick one of the 4 out of these, really think of what would you prefer, because frailty is the most common, but having that low function for such a period of time, speak to anyone who's elderly, a lot of them hate the fact that it's getting old is tragic. One of my favourite phrases is getting old is crap, but it's better than the alternative. But if you look through these, that organ failure, you can't imagine going through those ups and downs. So at the beginning you're thinking, oh yeah, you've had one organ problem and you're back almost at the level to what you started. but it just keeps getting worse and worse. And again, I think that and terminal illness probably quite heavily linked. They look very similar. Sudden death, again, is very uncommon, but frailty, and again, this could go into a discussion for a future video about the assisted dying, because that frailty, I think, can link into all of them except sudden death. But it's just something that, again, you would want to discuss, because otherwise you get to that point in your life where you need to have that discussion, and either you're not ready to do it or those around you aren't ready to do it, and they will have to be there, the ones you love, to help you with the decision and the outcome.
Inevitable part of aging and increasing frailty is in fact the main thing that people die of now. And the last few years or last year of your life is spent with a great deal of disability, unfortunately. Enjoying it so far? Sorry, I feel such a Cassandra here.
I feel you, sir. I feel you.
What can I say that's positive? What's positive is that this is happening at very great age now. We are all, most of us, living to reach this point. You know, historically we didn't do that. This is what happens to you when you live to be a great age. And unfortunately, increasing longevity does mean more old age, not more youth. I'm sorry to say that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. We've got to go back home.
What we did anyway, look, what we did, we didn't just take this lying down at John Hunter Hospital and elsewhere. We've started a whole series of projects to try and look about whether we could, in fact, involve people much more in the way that things happen to them. But we realise, of course, that we are dealing with cultural issues.
What on earth is that? And why have I not seen it before? It looks very similar to that famous painting where it's all gold and it's got like two couples, a couple, two people laying on a bed together. Is Death holding a hammer? So I suppose they're like a scythe or something. I like all the crosses as well. Where on earth is that? Someone let me know. I'm going to look that up after.
And this is, I love this Klimt painting, because the more you look at it, the more you
Klimt.
kind of get the whole issue that's going on here, which is clearly the separation of death from the living and the fear. Like, if you actually look, there's one woman there who has her eyes open. She's the one he's looking at, and he's the one he's coming for. Can you see that? She looks terrified. It's an amazing picture. Anyway, we had a major cultural issue. Clearly people didn't want us to talk about death. We thought that. So with loads of funding from the federal government and the local health service, we introduced a thing at John Hunter called Respecting Patient Choices. We trained hundreds of people to go to the wards and talk to people about the fact that they would die and what would they prefer under those circumstances. They loved it.
I've recently heard about people who do this. There's, or at least similar, called doulas. A lot of people may be aware of birth doulas, so people who will basically accompany the mother while she's going through the pregnancy and then subsequent birth, but they're doing it increasingly with people who are dying. That being more in demand, again, goes back to the fact that we don't really know how to approach it, and to have people who would be considered experts is something that is, say, increasing more and more. I imagine if that's what he was referring to, or at least something similar, something that I also am interested in getting involved with.
The families and the patients, they loved it. 98% of people really thought this just should be normal practice and that this is how things should work. And when they expressed wishes, all of those wishes came true, as it were. We were able to make that happen for them. But then when the funding ran out, we went back to look 6 months later, and everybody had stopped again. And nobody was having these conversations anymore.
There's not much money in talking about death, mate.
Because we thought this was going to really take off. The cultural issue had reasserted itself. So here's the pitch. I think it's important that we don't just get on this freeway to ICU without thinking hard about whether or not that's where we all want to end up, particularly as we become older and increasingly frail, and ICU has less and less and less to offer us. There has to be a little...
This is where I've always tried to be careful, because I would always argue that even if there is a slight opportunity that you can get to the ICU and get better, you need to take it, I would say, because it's hard to make that decision yourself if you don't have the medical experience of you know what you've got. If you know that it's terminal, or if you don't know if you're going to come out the other side, then again, I think that's what he's referring to. But I do think it is important to make that distinction.
Side road off there for people who don't want to go on that track. And I have one small idea and one big idea about what could happen. And this is the small idea. The small idea is let's all of us engage more with this in the way that Jason has illustrated. Why can't we have these kinds of conversations with our own elders and people who might be approaching this? There are a couple of things you can do. One of them is you can just ask this simple question. This question never fails. In the event that you became too sick to speak for yourself, who would you like to speak for you? That's a really important question.
Ooh. Oh my God. I'm going to be stealing that, Peter. Thank you for that. That's a really interesting question. For me, I actually don't know. Likely be my parents, someone who I think would know me best of what I believe in. I'll tell you what, it takes you to contemplation as to who would know you best as well. It's almost like picking a best man for your wedding, isn't it? Or, you know, or even a partner. Like I say, a lot of people would pick their romantic partner. Obviously, if you are not in that situation, then who would you pick?
To ask people, because giving people the control over who that is produces an amazing outcome. The second thing you can say is, have you spoken to that person about the things that are important to you so that we can got a better idea of what it is we can do? So that's a little idea.
It's a very good idea. I've not spoken to my parents about whether or not I'd become terminally ill. I think it would be way too upsetting. As I think it would be for anyone who would have a conversation about any member of their family. But I do agree, it is something that needs to be discussed on the very small chance that it will happen, because despite the probability of it happening, it's more how devastating it would be if it does happen and you don't have the conversation. It's the risk is so high with little pain that why would you not do? I say little pain though. No, it's a lot of pain emotionally. It's definitely worth considering.
The big idea, I think, is more political. I think we have to get onto this. I suggested we should have Occupy Death.
Sign me up.
My wife said, yeah, right, sit-ins in the mortuary. Yeah, sure. So that one didn't really run, but I was very struck by this. Now, I'm an aging hippie. I don't know, I don't think I look like that anymore, but I had two of my kids were born at home in the 80s when home birth was a big thing. And we baby boomers are used to taking charge of the situation. So if you just replace all these words of birth, I like peace, love, natural death as an option. I do think we have to get political and start to reclaim this process from the medicalized model in which it's going. Now listen, that sounds like a pitch for euthanasia. I want to make it absolutely crystal clear to you all. I hate euthanasia. I think it's a sideshow. I don't think euthanasia matters. I actually think that in places like Oregon, where you can have physician-assisted suicide, you take a poisonous dose of stuff. Only 0.5% of people ever do that. I'm more interested in what happens to them.
I think what he's referring to is, I think it was like half of people who sign up for the service in Oregon, where it was in America, so again, don't take this for gospel, but half the people who signed up for assisted dying didn't go through with it, so they get given the prescription of drugs and then they'll keep it near them and they just won't take it because they could eventually change their mind. I think that's what he's referring to.
99.5% of people who don't want to do that. I think most people don't want to be dead, but I do think most people want to have some control over how their dying process proceeds. So I'm an opponent of euthanasia.
But isn't that partly what euthanasia is? He's saying he's against it, but one of the main reasons people argue for it is that I'm undecided, I would say, on the matter, because I have my religious background where I would say you could try and fight it as long as you can. We only have a limited amount of time on earth, but I completely understand if someone in the situation would want to go through something like that. And again, unless you contemplate it a lot or are even facing the issues yourself, it will be difficult to make that decision. And it's maybe a topic for a later video.
But I do think we have to give people back some control. It deprives euthanasia of its oxygen supply. I think we should be looking at stopping the want for euthanasia, not for making it illegal or legal or worrying about it at all.
That is a good
This is a
idea.
quote from Dame Cicely Saunders, whom I met when I was a medical student. She founded the hospice movement. And she says, "You matter because you are, and you matter to the last moment of your life." And I firmly believe that that's the message that we have to carry forward. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Saul, or Dr. Saul probably, that was really good. I did expect it to be quite interesting. A lot of the points that he stated were stated much better than I think the video that I did previously about why discussing death is so important, but it echoes a lot of the sentiment. This is someone who's clearly very experienced in the field, who has seen the situation. You can see it on his face when he talks about it, how impassioned he was because of the experiences that he has. I really do think it's worth maybe watching again and contemplating some of the ideas that I brought out. For example, trying to answer the question that he brought out there. And it's going to be a lot to think about. I would then like to do a video on euthanasia, I think, in the future. Again, I don't think I'll be able to cover the full topic, and I would like to do a bit more research on that before I do the video. But that was really interesting. I'm really glad this was one of the first videos I did with the way that I'm moving this channel towards James Talks Death. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I will link to the previous video as to which I discuss why we should discuss death, essentially. Again, echoing a lot of what Peter Saul said here. But apart from that, do hit the subscribe button, leave a like, it really helps the algorithm, and enjoy the rest of your day. You take care.